Hello, everyone. My name is Trista. Welcome to another episode of Coffee and Clarity, Preventing Substance Misuse, where we're about to tackle the subject of marijuana. Today, we have an amazing guest, Dr. Ken Winters, a trailblazer in the world of research focusing on our health, especially when it comes to substance abuse. Dr. Winters, a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute, is here to guide us through the topic of teen marijuana use. His primary research revolves around harnessing the potential of the internet to empower teens in making informed decisions regarding their health. Dr. Winter brings a ton of knowledge to the table, and we're excited to begin this important conversation. Dr. Winters, thank you for being here. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Hi, Trista. Thanks for the very kind introduction. I'm a native Minnesotan, was at the University of Minnesota for 25 years, where we started our research in adolescent substance use. Now I spend some time with wonderful colleagues at the Oregon Research Institute, but still here in Minnesota, and have spent some wonderful nights and days in Fairmont. I enjoy southern Minnesota. It's always been an issue when we've studied teenagers that cannabis use was part of often a problem picture in a young person. And when it came to chemicals, you usually had, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis as a mixture. For some, it was mostly alcohol. For some, mostly cannabis. I think nowadays, in the last 10 years or so, there's just been, a shift in attitudes, a more permissive approach to cannabis, and that has probably led to more teens using cannabis when they might have been using another substance in years past.
Thank you for that introduction. Now we'll go right into the questions. My first question for you is, how does using marijuana affect teenagers' health?
Well, marijuana, and the main ingredient that we're going to talk about really is THC, or Delta 9, but that's the main intoxicant. It's what gets you high, although the plant has hundreds of compounds, and some of them do affect behavior and health, but THC is the main one. And it affects, many aspects of brain functioning and the way we think and our emotions. And then, of course, the way you take it may impact your lungs. So if you're smoking it or vaping it, it's got respiratory implications. The big question that often gets asked, revolving around your point, is, could it provide some positive health to people? And that's a great, complicated topic. I think on one hand, we all know that there are medicinal programs in a lot of states, including Minnesota. Minnesota has a cannabis medicine program, and there are several ailments and disorders on the list. There is not a lot of evidence for most of those disorders. So a lot of them got on the list because people anecdotally said, well, it helps me for this ailment or that disorder. But almost any substance somebody takes, whether it's cannabis or alcohol or nicotine or amphetamines, they're going to impact somebody's thinking and the way they feel. And so that might look like medicine to the person because it's changing, some negative state to a different state or even a positive one. But that wouldn't necessarily mean it's medicine, because it can have a lot of negative impact when you're taking something like THC at a very high level, and you're taking an intensive version of it, and it's having other kinds of impacts on the person. So on the negative health side, I'm just going to emphasize really how much it can impact somebody's mental health, risk for addiction, their motivation level to progress in life and to grow up and be healthy, and one's driving skill. So those are four big ones. There are others one could talk about, but I think the literature and the science out there is quite strong, indicating there's a lot of risk to those health arenas if you're using cannabis regularly, and that usually means weekly or daily. If you're using the high potency versions of cannabis, the concentrated THCs, and one other factor that's very relevant to this podcast and your audience, if you start using as a young person, as a teenager, the health impacts of cannabis, there's a lot of them. They get more accelerated to the extent that you start using early in life and you're using the heavy products on a regular basis. And one might ask, so why do young people, are more vulnerable? And so some of the science is looking at how it impacts brain development in a negative way. And this might contribute to some of these accelerated risks that occur when a young person is using, as opposed to if you wait till you're an adult.
Thank you. My second question is, what got you interested in studying this?
Well, back when we started as a research group, we were fortunate to get a grant to study a portion of this topic. The angle was, can we improve how clinicians assess teenagers to see if they have a drug problem or not? And so we were fortunate to be given a grant to study that topic. And once we went down that road and were able to succeed with that project and develop various tools, we realized the field also was lacking a lot of knowledge in treatment and prevention. So then we got a lot of grants and became interested in those avenues. So it was in part because there just wasn't as much research in this topic when we got started in the 1980s. And there was a great value in rigorous research to try to add to the knowledge base. There was a lot of prevention research back then, but people hadn't really studied what led teenagers to get addicted to substances. Or was it really addiction? Was it something maybe different and people were mislabeling it? So there was that, a big question of, is it a gray topic, a gray line in the sand where young people get addicted, or no, can young people show, bona fide symptoms of addiction? So I guess it was our curiosity, the fact there was, we thought, a lack of knowledge, and there was research opportunities in terms of grants.
Very cool. My next question for you are, what are some common misconceptions about these risks?
I think one of them is that cannabis is not a risky drug. I'm quoting the director of National Institute on Drug Abuse, Nora Volkoff, when she said she's a little worried that the problems with cannabis is going to hit us like alcohol and tobacco hit us, with all the concerns on the health impacts that were eventually discovered when those two other chemicals, drugs, were legalized and became popular in our culture. So I think that's one myth. It can be quite harmful and dangerous to use. It's a big risk, particularly if you're a young person using it. Another related myth is that it helps somebody with their mental health problems. I don't think that is the case. If you look at enough of the strong, I'll call it rigorous research, you find that while a person says, yeah, they get a little temporary relief for maybe depression or anxiety or those kinds of things, but in the long run, those problems get worse. So using it, as psychological medicine, I think is, a dangerous perception to have. I'll go a third one. Parents, I don't think are alert enough about the potential risk to cannabis use among young people. They might be reflecting when cannabis was used back in the 60s and 70s, and it was a much weaker product than it is now. And so that maybe leads parents to not, do, I think, the proper prevention work in the home.
Thank you for telling us about these myths. My next question is, can you explain what you've found about how teenagers' minds and behaviors can change when they use marijuana?
Well, one way to look at that question is that it can lead to kind of typical problems that emerge when someone gets addicted to any substance. That usually shows characteristics where an individual starts to use a drug compulsively, almost on a daily level. They feel like they need to use it all the time. They continue to use even in the face of negative consequences. So all kinds of social and personal consequences emerge. And then the person gets physical changes so that their body starts to crave the drug. Because if you use any of the substances, including THC, repeatedly, certain changes occur in the brain, and those changes actually hijack your ability to walk away or to resist the drug, and it just leads to greater craving. And then, of course, with that, you're more likely to use. That's a big health pattern. Another one we're worried about, some data, is the extent to which it just contributes someone to be less motivated to want to succeed in school. And so the link between school dropout and a loss of interest in school is showing up with young people that are using a lot of cannabis. And then the other one is this mental health topic. I know we've just talked about it, but it's strikes me as one of these problems where somebody is using cannabis because they think it's going to help with their mental health issues, but it really doesn't. It makes things worse. And so there's, too much showing up in the literature of how depression increases, risk for psychosis increases, and even anxiety problems. Some of those are all the features that can happen if a teenager is getting indulgent with cannabis.
Thank you for telling us. My next question is, what changes have you seen in how teenagers view marijuana over the years, and how does this impact your research?
I think there's just more permissiveness and a view that it's a safe drug that surely is not helped by states that are passing medicinal cannabis programs. So it makes sense for someone to think, well, wait, it's viewed as medicine. The state has even approved it as medicine, and the state has even approved it for legal use for adults. So that must not be all that serious a drug, and must not be all that harmful. So that has just changed, attitudes. And when that perception of harm goes that direction, usually interest in use increases. Also, that probably leads a person who's maybe minimally using to use even more. So you might get a picture of greater use at the higher end, and then that leads to a higher prevalence of those that are in trouble with the drug, which might mean more chemical dependency, more problems with mental health. With the state just passing legalization, that's probably going to accelerate kind of our challenges. So getting kids to realize it's not healthy to use during the teen years. If you're going to use any substance, wait until you're an adult. Wait until your brain is fully developed. I think there's more data now than ever that says early use of cannabis does more harm to the developing brain than early use of nicotine or alcohol. And these potential negative impacts can have a role in how well you learn, how motivated you are to be a good student, or at least to get through adolescence and try to lead a productive adult life. And like I say, it might help or harm one's mental health.
Very interesting. My next question is, how can parents and teachers have conversations about marijuana with teens, and why is it important?
Well, it's great you use the word conversation. I think that's a key. There needs to be a conversation. Be careful not to be too judgmental and to impose too many of one's own personal views or standards, even though that standard might be, a goal you have and the healthy outcome you'd like. You got to be careful to proceed slowly. I like to engage young people, and so what do they think about cannabis? What do they understand are potential harms? Why do they think young people use? Do you see some problems if you get indulgent in its use and use it too much? So getting good questions with teenagers and having them discuss it and seeing if you can steer their points of view more towards it's probably not a good idea to use during the youth years. It just elevates one's risk for all kinds of issues. It can be a great outcome. It's hard to tell young people you can't use at all, or that you have to lead a teen life full of abstinence. Experimenting and doing some risky behavior is so common among young people. You've got to acknowledge that. And all of the things I said are principles I think you can do in the classroom and at home. Teaching parents to do these things are critical.
Thank you. My next question is, can you share a story or example from your research that shows the challenges teenagers might face with marijuana?
Well, there's a couple that are devastating and have very terrible outcomes. Two cases I know of, they both share these kind of features. An individual, young person, starts using cannabis. They use it regularly. They want to accelerate the high, and cannabis isn't giving them enough of that high, and so they drift towards other drugs, quite serious drugs. And eventually, both people felt like they couldn't lead their life without drugs, and they tried to get treatment, but treatment was unsuccessful. They couldn't succeed in turning away. The urges were just getting so powerful, and both people ended their lives. They just felt like they got into a behavioral cycle that they couldn't get out of. So these kind of tragedies are I know rare, and it wasn't just a case in both instances where cannabis is the single cause, but cannabis started the process of that young person going down this addiction path. So these kind of stories are devastating, hard to hard to think about when we're trying to understand why we're legalizing a substance and why we're putting healthy spins around it. Then there's a whole set of stories that kind of fit a milder category, and that would just be young people saying, well, I'm cool because I can use it a little bit. I find that it helps me relax, and I'm an infrequent user, so I don't think I'm in danger of crossing the line. And I like to get in conversations with them about, well, tell me more about why you like to use. Do you see how your current use that you think isn't risky could accelerate and get a little worse? What safeguards do you have in place to prevent that? And some kids are really smart about that and talk about strategies, and they're going to make sure not to go too far. And obviously some succeed with that. Many young people use substances and grow out of it when they get into their adult years. But I just try to remind people that what we're talking about these days is pretty serious, deleterious drug. And you have to be careful because there's a lot of risks involved.
Thank you. My next question is, with marijuana becoming more accepted, what advice do you have for teens to make a safe choice?
Well, I mean, it would be a real simple, safe choice just to come to the conclusion it doesn't make sense to take the risk to use while I'm still a young person and wait until you're of legal age. As hopefully your audience knows, the recent law that was passed puts the minimum age at 21. So that was smart on one level because it did recognize that it's not a good idea to use prior to that age. But so it's try to avoid, stay the course with whatever other strategies and methods and approaches, peer support you can rely on to help negotiate the teen years. Don't let peer influence get in the way. If you're having issues with depression, anxiety, and you're thinking, get professional help, or use your family and your friends to as your support and health network. So trying to just draw a line in the sand with your own decision making and waiting until you're an adult. And then when you are an adult, you don't have to use the substances. Nicotine is very addictive. It's hard to just use it a little bit. There's a lot of people that can use alcohol at a low level, a social level. Cannabis might be in the middle. I think there's plenty of people, it looks like, use cannabis throughout their adult years at an infrequent level, and perhaps they're not adding much health risk to their life. But with the high potency products, particularly the concentrate products, realize it can add a lot more probability, a lot more likelihood that you are going to get addicted when you're dealing with some of these high potency type substances, and the high potency cannabis is one of them.
Very interesting. My next question is, how can understanding psychology help us figure out why teens might turn to marijuana and what can we do about it?
That's a good point because the best prevention programs try to address that. And they usually take these prevention approaches and strategies that teaching young people how to make good decisions when you're faced with a lot of temptations to not make such good decisions is a great skill set to have. So building that teenage toolbox of ways to address temptations, deal with risk. If you're going to take risk, do it in a healthy way. Don't let peer influence steer you down, a negative path. And realize that the human brain, whether you're a teenager or not, is vulnerable to the effects of all the chemicals of abuse. So our brains are wired in certain ways that we can get hijacked to get addicted. And once you start to insult your brain with chemicals such as THC, the brain goes through changes, and that leads to the psychological phenomenon of wanting to continue to use. So avoiding that trap, that negative cycle is such a big plus.
Thank you. My next question is, what are some simple signs that parents and teachers can look for to know if a teenager might be using marijuana?
It's hard to know. I just warn parents and teachers that a lot of things can be at play when you might see changes in a person's behavior. When it comes to cannabis, if someone is just used, and particularly if they've just smoked, you might be able to smell it in their hair, on their clothes. You might see the pupils dilated. They might show a different kind of emotional response when you talk to the person. Might be more blunted, or they might actually go the other direction where they're showing more euphoria than and excitement than would be expected from a given situation. So you might see some acute changes that are observable, but it is difficult to know if that's just due to cannabis. Parents just being aware of what's in the home, making sure that there's not cannabis products, having rules about parents' ability to make sure they know what's in the home, and teenagers realizing that there's not necessarily a protected place in the home that the parents aren't allowed in, I think is important. So it is hard to know, and that's why it's best to have conversations and keep lines of communication open.
Thank you. My next question is, could you share a positive outcome or success story from your research that shows the potential for positive change in teenagers dealing with marijuana issues?
One example comes from our research team. We hired a young man. He was in his young 20s, and he was interested in the topic in part because he went through a rough patch where he got addicted to cannabis and alcohol. So he was kind of, both drugs were at play with him. And he went to treatment once. It didn't work, but then he went a second time. And this was in part because he had great support from his friends and his parents. And he had, some access to treatment because he lived in a community where it was available. And after the second time, he realized he really needed to turn the corner. He wasn't going to be able to go back to his old ways. And he realized, he needs to be sober and be abstinent from all substances. And he felt that was the best way forward, best path for him as an adult. So it was nice to hear him talk about it in that way. It was reflective of what you often see. First time treatment sometimes doesn't work. Second time often can make the important impact on a person to make those important changes.
Thank you for telling us this story. My last question for you is, what is one thing you wish more people knew about your research and its impact on helping teenagers?
Well, I'll take the big picture to that great question. It's putting health as a number one topic in the home is so important. There's so many things going on when you're raising a teenager that maybe are indirectly related to health, but health sometimes gets put on the back burner. So having conversations and discussions specifically about health are quite vital. And for parents to show great modeling when it comes to their own behavior so that the health issues and health expectations they're trying to advance and have as a norm in the home are something that the parents are demonstrating. Now, schools getting into the health topic is also quite important since teens spend so much time in school. So I'm encouraged because most schools now have a health program, they have prevention curriculum, and they do their best to try to address mental health issues that might be occurring. So the extent a school can advance that, is a huge plus. I know that it can be a strain on resources, but I think the long-term benefits are extensive.
Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Ken Winters, and thank you all for listening.